The whole neighborhood chuckled when he said he was going to sleep inside a clay oven. And now, after one brutal Duluth night, they're not laughing anymore. A broke old veteran in a thick red and black buffalo plaid flannel jacket moved into a drafty cabin by Lake Superior, praying winter wouldn't finish what life already started. His loyal German shepherd Rex stayed glued to his side until the dog began whining at the floorboards, pawing the same corner night after night, like he could smell cold itself hiding underneath. So the veteran tore up the wooden bed dug into frozen earth and built something his grandfather once swore could hold heat like a captured sun, a heavy clay and stone oven bed with hidden channels inside. One single evening fire, then silence. No roaring stove, no shivering, just steady warmth under their backs while the storm raged outside like an angry god. But the real shock came when the coldest blizzard of the decade hit, and while other cabins froze, his stayed livable. That's when the whole town showed up at his door, asking the same question through chattering teeth: "How are you still warm?" Before we dive in, tell us where you're watching from. Drop your city, state, or country in the comments below, because it's wild to see how far these winter survival stories travel. Winter came down on Duluth like a judgment whispered from Lake Superior, heavy snow sealing the ground, wind cutting through bone nights, sinking far below zero. Frank Miller woke before dawn, the way old soldiers often did, not from noise but from silence, the kind that presses against the ears and makes the body listen for danger. At 72, his frame was still broad in the shoulders, though time had carved sharp lines into his face, deep grooves running from nose to mouth, a jaw squared by years of clenching teeth against fear orders and regret. His beard, once black, now grew in coarse silver patches that never quite lay flat, and his eyes, pale blue, almost washed out, carried the distant look of a man who had seen too many winters in places men were never meant to sleep. He sat up slowly on the wooden bed boots, already on out of habit, wrapped in the same thick red and black buffalo plaid flannel jacket he wore even indoors, the fabric faded at the elbows, the smell of smoke and pine soaked into it so deeply it felt like part of his skin. The cabin around him groaned as the wind shoved against its log walls, frost feathering along the seams where mud chinking had cracked. Cold crept upward from the raised plank floor, biting through wool socks, crawling into his knees and spine like an old enemy that knew all his weak points. Rex stirred beside him, the German shepherd, lifting his large, angular head ears scarred slightly, at the tips from youthful scuffles long past. At 10 years old, Rex's muzzle had begun to gray, but his body remained powerful, all dense muscle beneath a thick, gray-black coat that caught the firelight in dull silver streaks. His amber eyes followed Frank's movements with quiet vigilance, the way a soldier watches his commander without needing words. Rex did not bark in the mornings. He never had. Instead, he pressed closer, letting his warmth bleed into Frank's side, breathing slow and steady, a living reminder that at least one thing in this world still trusted him completely. Frank had built the cabin exactly the way the book said a man should. Standard log construction. A cast-iron stove hauled up from town at no small cost bolted into the northwest corner. A straight stovepipe punched through the roof, leaking heat into the sky like a confession no one asked for. The floor raised on joists to keep moisture away, gaps wide enough for the wind to whisper through. The bed placed far from the stove, safe from sparks, safe from fire, but not safe from cold. Every evening he fed the stove until the iron glowed, dull red hands cracked and aching from splitting wood, only to wake hours later, stiff and shaking joints, screaming breath fogging the air above his chest. He had survived firefights, ambushes, nights where death felt close enough to touch, yet here in peace, winter had found a quieter way to finish the job. As he stood and poured water from the bucket near the stove, he noticed again the thin skin of ice clinging to the rim even after hours of burning wood. It angered him more than it should have. Not the ice itself, but what it represented: wasted effort, wasted heat, wasted years, doing things the right way that never truly worked. He remembered younger men laughing, telling him to follow the manual stick to what was proven. The same laughter echoed now from town whenever he mentioned how cold his nights were. Duluth was full of men who believed endurance was the same thing as wisdom. Frank stepped outside to check the woodpile, Rex at his heel. Snow crunched beneath their boots and paws, the air so cold it burned the lungs. The lake was invisible beyond the trees, but he could feel it vast and ancient, breathing cold into the land. He had chosen this place because it was quiet, because no one asked questions, because after the war and the years that followed, silence felt like mercy. What he hadn't expected was how relentless the cold would be, how it would strip him down night after night, until even memories felt brittle. By late afternoon, he sat at the small pine table staring at the stove as if it were an opponent. Rex lay near the wall, chin on paws, eyes half closed, but alert. Frank's thoughts drifted uninvited back to a winter decades earlier overseas, when an older man in his unit, an immigrant with a thick accent and hands permanently stained with clay, had told stories by lantern light. Stories of villages where people slept on warm stone benches built into ovens, where one fire in the evening kept a family warm until morning. Frank had laughed then, young and cocky, convinced that steel and speed were all that mattered. Now the memory felt heavier, like something he had dropped long ago and only just realized was missing. He rose, pacing the cabin slowly, counting the places where cold leaked in. The floor, the walls, the bed itself raised like a mistake he'd repeated without question. Rex watched him tail thumping once when Frank stopped near the bed and stared down at it. The wood creaked as he pressed a hand against the frame, feeling how quickly it sucked warmth away. A strange, stubborn thought took hold, the kind that only comes when a man has nothing left to lose. What if the bed was wrong? What if comfort wasn't about avoiding heat, but embracing it, holding it close the way Rex pressed his body against Frank's leg without fear? That night, the temperature plunged further. The stove burned bright, then dimmed. Frank lay awake, pain blooming along his spine, his breath shallow. Rex shifted, whining softly, not from fear, but discomfort. Frank reached down and rested his hand on the dog's neck, fingers sinking into thick fur, grounding himself. In that moment, a decision settled in him, heavy and calm. He was tired of fighting winter with noise and fury, tired of feeding flames that vanished as soon as they were born. Somewhere beneath the floor, beneath the frozen earth, was a steadier kind of warmth waiting to be called back. By morning, his joints screamed, but his mind felt clear. He sat at the table, pulled a stub of pencil from his pocket, and turned over an old notebook, its pages yellowed, the cover scarred from years in a rucksack. Rex sat nearby, watching as lines appeared on the paper. Rough shapes, arrows, paths looping back on themselves. Frank did not smile. He rarely did anymore. But something in his chest eased, a quiet certainty forming like embers beneath ash. Outside, the wind howled and Duluth braced itself for another unforgiving day, unaware that in one small cabin at the forest's edge, winter had finally met a man willing to learn instead of endure. The laughter reached Frank Miller before the words did, carried on the cold air, like brittle glass snapping under boots. It happened at the small supply yard near the frozen road, where men gathered out of habit more than necessity, their breaths white, their shoulders hunched inside worn coats, faces hardened by years of labor and winter. Frank stood apart at first, his red and black buffalo plaid flannel jacket unmistakable among darker parkas, Rex sitting close at his left boot posture, alert but calm amber eyes tracking every movement with soldierly discipline. The men there were familiar faces, not friends exactly, but fixtures of the landscape, dock workers whose hands were permanently split, and scarred loggers with beards thick as brush and tempers shaped by exhaustion. They all lived in cabins like his, built the same way, cursed the same cold, burned the same endless stacks of wood, and yet something in Frank's quiet confidence unsettled them. When he finally spoke, voice low and measured, explaining that he planned to tear out his wooden bed and build a clay and stone heated platform. Instead, the response came instantly, sharp and dismissive. One man bent double laughing, another spat into the snow and shook his head. Someone muttered that the old vet had finally frozen his brain solid. Frank did not flinch. He had heard worse laughter in worse places. Laughter edged with fear before gunfire. Laughter used to hide the certainty that someone would not make it through the night. Among the group stood Harold Klein, a dock foreman in his late 50s, tall but stooped with a thick iron-gray mustache that drooped over a mouth permanently set in skepticism. Harold's face was broad and weather-darkened, his eyes small and restless, always calculating, shaped by decades of counting cargo, counting men, counting losses. He was not cruel by nature, but life had taught him that deviation invited disaster. It was Harold who finally spoke through the chuckles, telling Frank that Europe was an ocean away, and old country fairy tales had no place in Minnesota winters. He gestured toward the frozen lake, toward the sky, toward reality as he understood it. Frank met his gaze steadily, seeing not mockery, but fear of change, fear that something better might exist, and that he had been enduring misery unnecessarily for years. Rex shifted at Frank's side, nails clicking softly on ice, head tilting, as if listening beyond the human noise. Frank rested a gloved hand briefly on the dog's neck, grounding himself, then turned away without argument. He had learned long ago that convincing men was a waste of breath until proof arrived on its own. As he walked back toward the forest road, the laughter followed him, growing louder, fueled by relief that someone else had become the fool instead of them. Yet beneath the sound, Frank felt a strange calm. The laughter reminded him of another time, another group of men huddled in cold darkness, laughing at ideas that later saved their lives. The memory came unbidden as he trudged home through knee-deep snow, Rex breaking trail ahead with steady purpose. It was Korea winter, biting harder than any place Frank had known, the ground frozen so solid that even the dead resisted burial. He had been young then, shoulders unscarred, jaw unlined, still believing obedience was the same thing as wisdom. In that unit, there had been an older man named Anton Volkov, thick-bodied, despite the cold hands, broad and powerful fingers permanently stained the color of earth. Anton's beard had been dense and black, streaked with gray, even then, his eyes dark and patient, his English broken but precise. Anton was not a fighter by trade. He had been a mason before the war, conscripted into violence the way others were conscripted into hunger. On nights when the wind howled through the encampment, and men huddled uselessly around failing heaters, Anton had told stories in a low voice, stories about homes built around warmth, instead of fear, about clay and stone ovens that held heat like memory itself. Frank remembered laughing back then, too, shaking his head thinking such things belonged to peasants and myths. Yet he also remembered the night when their heater failed entirely, and Anton improvised a crude stone enclosure around a fire pit, banking heat until morning, saving fingers, saving lives. The laughter had died quickly that night. Back in the present, Frank reached the cabin as dusk fell, sky bruised, purple and gray. Inside, the cold greeted him immediately, familiar and intimate. Rex shook snow from his coat and moved to his usual spot, watching as Frank removed gloves, set down supplies, and pulled the old notebook back onto the table. The pencil moved again, lines growing more confident, shapes more deliberate. Frank's mind worked steadily, not rushing, testing each idea against memory and experience. He could almost hear Anton's voice correcting him, reminding him that heat was not something to chase, but something to trap, something to respect. His chest tightened briefly at the thought of that old man long gone, another casualty claimed by history, yet here in this moment more present than the laughter at the supply yard. As the stove crackled behind him, Frank imagined the bed not as furniture, but as an anchor, a mast that would remember fire long after flames died. He pictured Rex sleeping without curling tight, without shivering, muscles relaxed instead of braced. The thought brought an unexpected sting to his eyes, quickly dismissed. He had learned to bury tenderness beneath practicality, but age had a way of loosening old defenses. Outside wind battered the cabin, testing it, mocking his thin walls and raised floor. Frank welcomed the challenge. He had faced worse tests from less predictable enemies. Later that night, there came a knock, hesitant but firm. Frank opened the door to find Sarah Whitman standing in the snow arms, wrapped tightly around herself. Sarah was in her early 40s, tall and narrow-shouldered with pale skin reddened by cold and wind, her dark blonde hair pulled into a tight braid that fell over one shoulder. Her face bore the marks of constant worry, fine lines etched around her eyes and mouth, but her gaze was direct, intelligent, unafraid. She lived alone at the edge of town after her husband's death, in a dock accident 2 winters earlier, supporting herself with odd jobs and quiet resilience. She did not laugh easily, having learned what cold indifference could cost. Sarah explained that she had heard the laughter, heard the plan, and wanted to know if Frank truly believed it would work. Frank studied her for a moment, then stepped aside to let her in, Rex sniffing her boots politely, before retreating. They spoke briefly, words practical and unembellished. Frank did not promise success. He spoke instead of principles of patience, of the difference between noise and warmth. Sarah listened carefully, nodding eyes flicking occasionally toward the icy corners of the cabin, as if imagining her own nights alone. When she left, she thanked him quietly, not for answers, but for the honesty. Frank watched her disappear into the snow, aware that not everyone laughed, that some simply waited to see. But at night, as Frank lay awake, Rex pressed against his side, the laughter from earlier replayed in his mind, not as insult, but as fuel. He had been shaped by war, by loss, by long winters of endurance, but he had also been shaped by forgotten men and half-remembered wisdom. Outside, Duluth slept uneasily under its frozen blanket, unaware that its routines were about to be questioned. Frank closed his eyes, the image of stone and clay steady in his thoughts, knowing that the next step would require more than memory. It would require action. Snow fell without ceremony, thick and steady, sealing the forest around Frank Miller's cabin into a narrow white world where sound felt swallowed before it could travel. Frank worked in silence, not because he had nothing to say, but because silence had become his most trusted companion. At dawn, he pried up the first plank of the wooden floor, the old boards protesting with sharp cracks, as if offended to be questioned after decades of unquestioned service. Cold rushed upward immediately, a breath from the frozen earth itself, stinging his knuckles even through gloves. Frank paused only long enough to steady his breathing. He had learned in war that hesitation wasted strength. Rex stood nearby, tall ears upright, thick gray-black coat dusted with snow, watching every movement with focused concern. At 10 years old, Rex had slowed just enough to show wisdom, not weakness. His muzzle had gone pale, but his body remained solid, and when Frank knelt to dig, Rex shifted position to block the wind, instinctively placing himself between his human and the worst of the cold. The ground beneath the cabin fought back like an old adversary. The first few inches yielded reluctantly, then turned stubborn, the soil locked into iron hardness by weeks of sub-zero nights. Frank chipped away methodically, muscles burning breath, measured sweat freezing along his collar. Each strike of the shovel echoed faintly, swallowed by snow and trees. He worked until his hands numbed, then worked longer, driven by something deeper than comfort. This was not about warmth alone. It was about reclaiming agency from a winter that had treated him like a weak man waiting to fail. Rex circled occasionally, barking sharply when the wind rose too fast, his voice sharp with concern rather than command, as if reminding Frank that survival was not a race. By the third day, a shallow pit had taken shape beneath the space where the bed once stood. Frank hauled stones from the lake shore and nearby outcroppings, selecting them with care. He avoided anything brittle or layered, trusting his hands and eyes more than any rule. The stones were heavy, some rough-edged, others worn smooth by centuries of water and ice, each carrying the quiet patience of time. Frank stacked them beside the cabin, muscles trembling with effort, feeling oddly grateful for the ache. Pain was familiar. Pain was honest. Rex followed each trip, tail low but steady paws, leaving precise prints in the snow that soon vanished beneath falling flakes. The clay came from a narrow cut along a creek bank half a mile away, blue-gray and dense, slick and cold to the touch. Frank remembered Anton Volkov's hands, the way they moved through clay as if greeting an old friend. Frank's own hands were clumsier, stiff with age and scars, but the memory guided him. He mixed the clay with sand and straw in a battered metal tub, working until the texture felt right, not too wet, not too crumbly. It was a slow process, one that punished impatience. More than once, Frank had to stop himself from rushing, from forcing progress the way younger men might. Rex watched with head cocked, as if evaluating the mixture's readiness with senses Frank no longer possessed. As the structure rose, it became less a project and more a presence. The internal channels curved and folded through the stone mass paths, designed to make heat linger instead of escape. Frank checked and rechecked each passage, smoothing edges with gloved fingers, ensuring no sharp turn would trap smoke or choke the draw. He spoke aloud occasionally, not to Rex, but to the memory of Anton, arguing quietly, testing assumptions. Rex responded by shifting closer, his flank pressed against Frank's leg, warmth shared without ceremony. The platform itself extended outward, a broad stone surface built low, close to the earth, large enough for a man and his dog. Frank imagined sleep there, not elevated and exposed, but grounded, held by something that remembered fire long after flame died. On the fifth evening, with the temperature hovering around 10 below zero, Frank decided it was time. He cleared the cabin, checked seals, and built a careful fire in the small firebox opening he had shaped with deliberate restraint. The flames caught quickly, licking along dry wood, their sound different from the iron stove's roar. This fire felt contained, purposeful. Frank fed it steadily, not greedily, watching how the heat traveled, how the stone responded. Rex lay a few feet back at first, cautious eyes bright with curiosity rather than fear. After an hour, Frank placed his bare palm on the stone platform. Warmth radiated upward, slow and steady, not the biting heat of iron, but something deeper, gentler. He exhaled without realizing he had been holding his breath. As the fire burned down to embers, the cabin grew quiet. No crackling metal, no sudden drops in temperature. Frank lay down cautiously, boots off spine, stiff with expectation. The stone beneath him held firm, warm through layers of wool, easing tension from his joints with patient insistence. Rex hesitated only a moment before climbing up beside him, curling against Frank's chest, releasing a long, satisfied breath that spoke volumes. Outside, the wind howled harder, battering the cabin walls, but the cold no longer felt invasive. It felt distant, inconvenienced. Sleep came without struggle. Frank drifted not into the shallow, half-alert rest he had known for years, but into something deeper, heavier. Dreams surfaced unbidden, of marching through snow, without pain of fires, that did not need constant feeding of hands, shaping earth into shelter instead of graves. When he woke, it was light outside. The silence was complete. For a moment, panic flickered an old reflex, but it faded quickly as Frank became aware of his body. He was warm, not briefly, not artificially, but thoroughly, as if the night had passed without cold ever entering the room. Rex stretched beside him, tail thumping once against stone eyes, calm, content. Frank pressed his hand to the platform again. Warm. Not hot, but alive with stored heat. He sat up slowly, joints protesting less than usual, and let out a breath that trembled despite his effort to keep it steady. He had expected improvement. He had not expected this. Outside, the temperature had dropped further overnight. Frost coated the trees, the cabin roof thick with ice. Yet inside, the stone remembered the fire releasing warmth as faithfully as a heartbeat. Later that morning, Sarah Whitman appeared again, bundled against the cold, her expression cautious but hopeful. Frank did not boast. He invited her inside and let her feel the stone herself. She knelt, removed one glove, and pressed her palm to the surface, eyes widening slightly. Sarah's face, pale and drawn by years of quiet endurance, softened. She did not smile broadly, but something eased behind her eyes, a tightness loosening. She said little, only nodded, absorbing the evidence in silence. Rex watched her closely, then leaned into her touch when she scratched behind his ear, granting approval with quiet dignity. When Sarah left, Frank returned to the platform and sat hands resting on warm stone. He knew this was only the beginning. One night proved possibility, not permanence. There would be adjustments, failures, lessons paid for in sweat and patience. But as he looked at Rex, at the firebox, now cold and clean, at the stone that still gave heat freely, Frank allowed himself a rare thing belief, not rooted in endurance but in understanding. Winter had not been defeated. It had been answered. January arrived like an enemy that had learned patience, settling over Duluth, with a cold so deep it no longer shocked but crushed day after day, night after night, until even seasoned men began to doubt their own endurance. The wind off Lake Superior screamed without rhythm, slamming against cabins with a force that felt personal, as if the lake itself resented human presence along its frozen edge. Snow piled high against doors and walls, roofs bowed under weight, and inside many homes, water froze in buckets, set only a few feet from glowing stoves. Frank Miller watched this unfold from his small cabin at the forest's edge, not with pride, but with a cautious awareness that what he had built was about to be tested beyond mercy. Inside Frank's cabin, the difference was subtle but undeniable. There was no roaring furnace heat, no suffocating waves of hot air followed by bitter collapse. Instead, the warmth remained steady, almost stubborn. Each evening, Frank built a single deliberate fire in the clay and stone bed, feeding it carefully, then letting it burn itself into memory. By midnight, the firebox was cold, but the stone beneath the bedding remained warm, radiating upward like a living thing. Rex sprawled across the platform without curling tight. His long body stretched fully, paws twitching occasionally in dreams, ears lifting only when the wind struck the cabin particularly hard. At 10 years old, Rex had known cold all his life, but this was the first winter where it did not define his rest. Frank noticed changes in himself as well. He woke without the familiar grinding pain in his lower back, without the stiffness that usually forced him to sit for long minutes before standing. His breath no longer fogged the air immediately upon waking. The cabin still creaked, still groaned under pressure, but it no longer felt hostile. Frank did not celebrate. Years of disappointment had taught him caution. Instead, he measured, observed, adjusted. He patched small gaps, reinforced clay joints, learned how the system responded to longer cold spells. This was not a miracle. It was a dialogue between man and winter, and for the first time, winter was listening. Beyond Frank's property line, desperation grew louder with each passing day. Harold Klein's dockside cabin burned through wood at a terrifying pace. Harold himself, tall and stooped with his iron-gray mustache now rimmed in frost, more often than not became sharper in tone, less patient with his crew. Pride kept him feeding the stove even when the woodpile shrank dangerously low. Others were not so stubborn. A younger couple down the road, faces hollow with exhaustion, dismantled a kitchen table to keep their stove alive through one particularly brutal night. The smell of old varnish and burning glue hung in the air for days afterward, a scent that spoke of loss rather than warmth. The first knock on Frank's door came just before sunset, on a night when the temperature plunged past anything forecast. It was a man named Daniel Rourke, a former logger in his early 60s, broad-chested, but slumped forward as if bracing against invisible blows. His beard was thick and tangled, streaked with white, his skin weathered into a map of scars and cracks. Daniel's cabin sat closer to the lake, fully exposed to wind, and his usual confidence had been stripped away by exhaustion. He did not joke. He did not laugh. He asked simply if he could warm his hands for a moment. Frank stepped aside without comment. Rex Rose sniffed Daniel carefully, then allowed him to sit near the stone platform, eyes never leaving the stranger, but posture calm. Daniel's reaction was immediate and involuntary. His shoulders sagged as warmth soaked into his palms. He stared at the stone beneath him, disbelief written plainly across his face. He asked questions in short bursts, words tumbling over one another, but Frank raised a hand, gently slowing him. He explained only what was necessary, nothing more. Daniel left an hour later with color back in his cheeks and something heavier than warmth in his chest. Hope, perhaps. Or fear that everything he thought he knew had been wrong. Word spread quietly, not through boasting, but through survival. Mary Ellison arrived next, a woman in her mid-30s with wind-burned cheeks and tired eyes, her dark hair tucked beneath a wool hat, far too thin for the weather. She lived alone with 2 young children after her husband died in a shipping accident the previous spring. Mary did not linger. She stood, held her hands out over the warm stone tiers, freezing along her lashes, as she whispered that her children's blankets had turned stiff with frost the night before. Frank gave her no promises, only knowledge, and sent her home with Rex's old spare blanket layered with straw, an imperfect solution, but one born of compassion rather than pity. Even Harold Klein came eventually, though he stood stiffly in the doorway, at first pride warring visibly with need. Frank saw the change in Harold's eyes as soon as he stepped inside, the way calculation gave way to something like humility. Harold did not apologize. He did not need to. He asked questions carefully, hands clasped behind his back, studying the stone like a man confronting evidence in a trial he had already lost. Rex watched him closely, ears forward, sensing the shift in power. When Harold finally left, he nodded once, a gesture heavier than words. The cold reached its peak in late January. Winds howled for days without pause, driving snow into every seam, every weakness. Several roofs in the area sagged dangerously under accumulated ice. One partially collapsed, forcing its occupants to shelter elsewhere. Through it all, Frank's cabin remained steady. The stone bed never went cold. The walls stayed dry. The air inside held warmth without choking. Frank found himself hosting visitors almost daily, not as a savior, but as a witness to what patience and forgotten wisdom could accomplish. One evening, Sarah Whitman returned, her tall, slender frame wrapped in a patched coat braid tucked tightly down her back. Her pale skin looked drawn, but her eyes were sharper than before. She had watched the change from a distance, listening more than speaking. Sitting beside Frank, she admitted quietly that she had stopped laughing years ago, not because life was cruel, but because cruelty had taught her the cost of certainty. She asked if he thought such a system could be built elsewhere with different hands, different land. Frank met her gaze and answered honestly, it would take time and failure and respect for materials. But yes, the warmth beneath them was proof. As the month crawled toward its end, the laughter that once followed Frank faded entirely. In its place grew a different sound, the quiet murmur of men and women rethinking choices they had accepted as law. Frank did not feel vindicated. He felt something far stranger and more fragile. Responsibility. Knowledge carried weight, and winter was not finished yet. That night after the last visitor left, Frank sat beside Rex on the warm stone, listening to the wind lose itself against walls it could no longer penetrate. For the first time in many years, Frank allowed himself to imagine not just surviving winter, but outlasting it. Spring did not arrive all at once in Duluth. It crept in reluctantly like a guest, unsure of its welcome after causing so much damage. Snow softened into gray slush along the forest paths. The lake's ice groaned and fractured, and roofs slowly released the weight they had carried for months. Frank Miller noticed the change not by temperature alone, but by sound. The wind lost its sharp edge. The cabin stopped complaining in the night. The stone beneath his bed, though no longer fed by fire each evening, still held a memory of warmth that lingered like a final word spoken gently. Frank rose one morning, joints stiff but manageable, and realized with quiet certainty that the worst of winter had passed, and with it something inside him had shifted permanently. Frank did not become a hero when the thaw came. No one erected plaques or spoke his name with ceremony. That suited him. He had spent a lifetime watching how easily praise could rot into expectation, how admiration often came with chains. Instead, he worked. Men and women came to his property in ones and twos, boots, muddy faces, tentative, asking questions, not out of curiosity now, but respect. Frank showed them without flourish how to read stone, how to listen to the earth when choosing clay, how to mix patience into every step. His hands moved slowly, deliberately, thick fingers scarred from old injuries, guiding younger, softer ones. Rex sat nearby through it all, his gray-black coat shedding heavily. As winter released its grip, amber eyes calm and observant. At 10 years old, Rex had become a quiet sentinel, rising only when strangers approached too quickly, then settling once Frank nodded. It was as if the dog understood that this knowledge was not to be guarded with teeth but with discernment. Sarah Whitman came often. In the clearer light of spring, her features softened. She remained tall and slender, her movements efficient, but the deep tension that once pulled her shoulders inward began to ease. Her dark blonde hair, usually bound tight in a braid, sometimes slipped loose, now catching sunlight in uneven strands. Her skin, pale and weathered, still bore the marks of long winters, but color had returned to her cheeks. Sarah learned quickly, not because she was eager to impress, but because she listened. She asked careful questions, thoughtful ones about airflow and mass, about mistakes Frank had made along the way. Her husband's death had stripped her of illusions. She had no interest in shortcuts. Frank recognized something familiar in her focus, the quiet resolve of someone who had already lost too much to gamble with survival again. Others learned more slowly. Harold Klein struggled the most. Used to command and efficiency, the dock foreman found patience uncomfortable. His iron-gray mustache twitched whenever Frank told him to slow down to feel the clay rather than measure it. Yet Harold returned each week, pride tempered by memory of how close he had come to failure. Daniel Rourke brought his strength, willingly hauling stone without complaint, his broad frame moving with renewed purpose now that the cold no longer gnawed at him. Mary Ellison never asked for help directly. She watched, absorbed, practiced quietly. Frank noticed that her eyes no longer carried the same desperation they once had. Knowledge, even partial, had given her something solid to stand on. Frank did not charge money. He accepted Laborwood's silence. He believed that once knowledge was traded like currency, it lost its soul. This belief came not from idealism, but from war. He had seen how systems collapsed when value replaced trust. Instead, he taught those who stayed long enough to learn properly, those who failed once and returned without excuses. Rex seemed to approve leaning against those who listened, ignoring those who rushed. As weeks passed, small changes rippled through the community. New construction did not look the same as old. Beds were built lower. Stones appeared stacked beside cabins. Clay pits formed along creek banks. Conversations changed tone. People spoke less about enduring winter and more about preparing for it. Frank observed this with mixed emotion. There was satisfaction, yes, but also a quiet grief. How many winters had been wasted suffering unnecessarily? How many bodies broken by cold when warmth had been possible all along? One afternoon, as ice finally released the lake's edge, Frank sat with Rex outside the cabin, both of them facing the water. The dog's coat gleamed in the sun, thick, but shedding age visible now in the slower rise of his chest. Frank scratched behind Rex's ears, fingers lingering. He thought of Anton Volkov, of men lost of knowledge buried beneath progress and pride. Rex leaned into the touch, eyes half-closed, content. Frank understood then that Rex had been more than companion. He had been anchor, a reminder to stay grounded, to trust instincts when logic alone failed. The final visitors of the season came quietly. A young couple from farther inland, faces open and cautious, listened intently. Frank spoke less than before. He no longer needed to convince. The evidence stood in stone and warmth. When they left, he returned inside, sat on the cooling platform, and felt something he had not expected, peace unaccompanied by vigilance. For decades, survival had demanded constant readiness. Now readiness gave way to rest. That night, Frank built one last fire, not from necessity, but ritual. He watched the flames catch, listened as the stone accepted the heat, and felt gratitude without direction. Gratitude for survival, yes, but more for understanding. Rex lay beside him, older now, but steady, breathing slow. Frank rested his palm on the stone, then on Rex's back, connecting earth and life in one simple gesture. When the fire died and the stone glowed with stored warmth, Frank whispered a quiet prayer, not to be spared hardship, but to remember what hardship had taught him. Winter would return. It always did. But it would never again arrive unanswered. At the end, this story was never really about stone, clay, or winter. It was about a quiet kind of miracle, the kind that doesn't fall from the sky with thunder, but rises slowly from patience, humility, and faith. God did not remove the cold from Frank's life. He gave him wisdom instead. He did not silence the wind. He taught him how to build something that could endure it. And that is how miracles often work, not by changing the world around us, but by changing what we build within it. In our daily lives, we all face winters of our own. Seasons where no matter how much effort we burn, the warmth seems to vanish, and the nights feel too long to bear. This story reminds us that more fire is not always the answer. Sometimes God is asking us to slow down, to listen, to remember forgotten truths, to store love, patience, and faith deep inside so they can carry us through the coldest hours. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to share it with someone who might need a little warmth today. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from and what this story meant to you. Your words may become part of someone else's miracle. And if you believe stories like this matter, don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay with us for more journeys of hope, resilience, and quiet grace. May God bless you, protect you, and keep you warm through every season of your life.